Hi guys, and welcome back to every episode of Family Guy Season 16 Reviewed. I hope you're all still enjoying this series. I certainly am, a bit more than I was a few seasons back, that's for sure, when I was really struggling through. And this season seems to have a decent reputation amongst the fanbase, so he is hoping, fingers crossed, for a good one. In terms of the behind the scenes of this season, I don't have too much to add, other than this was the first time the show's syndication rights switched over to Disney, so maybe the darkest times are yet to come. I joke, of course. Honestly, I really do hope this season continues to improve, and maybe even breaks into the good category. Anyway, let's hurry into the episodes to find out, shall we? Season 16, Episode 1, Emmy winning episode. Tired of not winning an Emmy, Peter embarks on his own campaign for Family Guy. My best cutaway here was the old lady's eyebrows in Downton Abbey. And my best moment was Peter throwing people through the window in an attempt to win the stunt and documentary Emmys. The season opener gets a 3 out of 5. Using the fact that Family Guy never won an Emmy as an episode idea was quite creative. Like, why not try it? It's better than more of the same every time. Sure, this was a bit frantic and all over the place, but that was on purpose, as they went from a comedy story to a pandering inspirational one to a full-blown drama one, and finally they end up trying for every single Emmy category. As usual from Family Guy, there was a lot of sarcastic moments and piss-taking out of various shows throughout, and those were in fact my favourite moments, because none of the stories themselves were amazingly entertaining, whether it be Peter's fake transition to a woman, or him getting into these crazy shootouts. It was all very watchable, don't get me wrong, but none of it left any kind of lasting impression. Same goes for the ending, where the show calls itself out for making everything go back to normal in the same old fashion. This was not the most gag-heavy episode because of the reliance on action scenes, but as I say, I did like Peter hurling Brian and Stewie through the window out of nowhere, and the reference to Maggie Smith's eyes on Downton Abbey. Her eyes were actually kind of like that, God bless her. Season 16, Episode 2, Fox in the Men House. Peter meets a paramedic named Striker Fox, and the two hit it off. However, he lets his cool new friendship come between him and his old friends. My best cutaway here was Peter as a rookie firefighter going up the pole through the roof. My best moment overall was Peter getting Stewie to hold his iPad to watch House of Cards on the toilet. I gave this one a 3 out of 5. This was another decent if unspectacular one. I liked the Act 1 setup actually, with Peter trying out all of these luxurious female bathrooms, especially the bit where he hangs Stewie on a hook and gets him to hold the iPad. Stewie replying to Lois's messages on it was also funny, how he almost gets Peter in trouble before the battery dies. Unlike the meatballs, the meat of this story is Peter hanging out with Striker Fox and doing all these crazy things together, while neglecting his regular friends. It was fun enough. Well, apart from the graphic way he dies by slamming into the mountain, the cutaway of Peter identifying the body was quite brutal as well. It seemed like all of this would just be the routine ending, where Peter and the guys make up, and it kind of was. However, all of Peter's antics, and even Striker himself, were revealed to be all Peter's dreams from his head trauma. This twist wasn't really necessary. I mean, it doesn't change my opinion about the episode for the worse, but it doesn't add anything either. The jokes here were solid, I would say. I liked Peter on the circular roller coaster, and the observation about how, for Olympic coverage, they often draft in some announcers from other sports who aren't at all knowledgeable about the sport they're covering. That is definitely true. As I said though, the silly visual of Peter going up the fire pole through the roof was the best. Season 16, Episode 3, Nanny Goats. After Lois and Peter get into an argument about Peter keeping goats in the house, they decide to go on a bonding trip. While away, they get a nanny for the kids, My best cutaway here was the long Craigslist. And best moment was Peter's exhale after Lois can't find the directions in time. I gave this one a 3 out of 5 again. The setup to this episode of Peter getting loads of goats to cut the lawn for them, only to take over the whole house, was a bit weird, but it had a few okay gags, and did set up Peter and Lois deciding to do stuff together in a desperate attempt to get their relationship back on track. Some of the moments on their trip away I especially enjoyed. Lois rummaging through her purse, while a frustrated Peter waited for directions for the turnoff, was damn funny, and I'm sure damn relatable for a lot of people. Him sighing so hard that it steams up the windshield was the cherry on top. The big moth in the lampshade was also interesting. I don't blame Peter for being afraid of it, honestly. Now, all of the arguing between Peter and Lois was nothing we haven't seen countless times before, and the ending was a bit abrupt and brushed away all of their relationship issues. I guess they will just go on pretending that everything is okay, while feeling unsatisfied deep down. Thankfully, I did enjoy the subplot here, where they get a nanny from Bulgaria named Natalia. It's refreshing how no-nonsense she is. And of course the action sequence, where she takes care of all her enemies, while keeping Stewie safe in the process, was incredibly badass. Despite not doing enough for a 4, this still rounded up being an okay episode overall. Season 16, Episode 4, Follow the Money. Carter sends Chris a special $1 bill for his birthday. After Chris loses it, the bill passes through Quahog, with Carter and Chris desperate to get it back. There were no cutaways here, so that's short and sweet, and my best moment was Lois getting into a slap fight with the giant chicken's wife. This one gets a 4 out of 5. It breaks the free streak in a positive direction. I found this to be a very interesting episode that at first appears similar to 22 short films about Springfield, but while there are similarities, the main difference was that the Simpsons episode floated more randomly between characters, while this episode made sure to follow the $1 bill at all times. It did work to keep the story centered on one main goal, but of course all the coincidences, which made the dollar bill keep switching between characters, was not at all believable. But does it need to be believable in an episode like this? I don't think so, really. This episode's goal was to show us some silly moments from a large cast of characters, and I think it succeeded in that goal. Some of my favourite moments were the intense stare down between Lois and the female chicken, making it seem like it would erupt into this big fight, only for them to get into a poxy slapping fight instead. And Chris thinking that a surprise party meant that he had to run up to everyone yelling surprise is just the type of silliness we expect from him. But what was really interesting was all the references they put in to old episodes, and all the cameos from characters we don't get to see very often. Little things like Connie and Dylan's mother being the pole dancers at the club, and Gillian working at the coffee place. So yeah, this worked as something different, mainly because there was something to keep an eye on all the way through. Season 16, Episode 5, 3 directors. We get a Family Guy spin on 3 famous movies by directors Quentin Tarantino, Wes Anderson and Michael Bay. For the second episode in a row, there were no cutaways here, but my best moment was undoubtedly Peter killing Angela and all the Trisha Takanawa clones, in a rather violent way as you can see there. I gave this one a 2 out of 5. We have another 3-parter here. While I am enjoying the season's willingness to change the format up, on this occasion it fell a bit flat for me. Now the first part where Peter gets fired from the brewery was my favourite. It was a simple and easy to follow revenge story from Peter's perspective. The ending where he goes back to the brewery to take everyone out was the highlight of the episode. Sure, it was overly violent, but it was that way on purpose. We just got to enjoy Peter slicing them all up with such ease. Also, the blood acting like stage lights was an interesting visual. Opera music makes violence classy. The second story, however, if you can't say anything nice, even if I wanted to talk about it, I couldn't. I have already forgot what it was all about. It was that pointless. The final part of Peter as this muscle guy stopping Transformers was as random as it gets, but at least unlike part 2, I didn't forget about it immediately after watching. Overall, as I say, this episode didn't do it for me. I just found the action boring for the most part, so it was unable to make up for a lack of good jokes. I understand some people probably like this a lot more, but it was just one of those episodes which didn't click with me. Season 16, Episode 6. Lydie in Apartment 23. Brian tweets a racially insensitive remark, and soon gets an angry hate mob on his case. The constant harassment against the family caused them to kick Brian out of the house. My best cutaway here was Peter fooling around at Dick's Sporting Goods, and my best moment was the Kingsman parody, that big fight scene in the cafeteria. I gave this one a 4 out of 5. This was interesting. It started out fairly strong with a few decent jokes, like Peter demanding shepherd's pie, and messing with the guy at Dick's Sporting Goods, getting him to say it. Soon though, Brian starts getting active on Twitter, and it doesn't take him long to get into trouble with the outrage mob. All he did was tweet a nothing burger throwaway joke. Nothing wrong with it at all in my opinion. But some people do indeed take life far too seriously and get worked up about such things. Now, the response Brian got in this episode was a bit overblown and exaggerated, I guess. But then again, it's not that much of an exaggeration, given that people really have been put out of work for things they have said. And in some countries, including shamefully my own, the police do sometimes get involved in posts which they deem offensive or hate speech. So people can and do have their lives ruined, in ways as petty as Brian does in this episode. I did like the scene where Brian snapped at the protesters outside his house. He delivered some home truths, in a funny way, how he is actually the real left-wing progressive one. And he's actually slept with a transsexual, so he deserves all the brownie points for that. Obviously that's not true. Just because you've done that, it doesn't automatically absolve you of all the bad things you may have said or done. But I guess he was trying to appeal to their logic. Anyway, suffice to say it didn't work. The second half of the episode, the jokes dried up quite a bit, but obviously that was intentional. They wanted to hammer home how much of a shambles Brian's life has become, how the family can't deal with the abuse they get just for being associated with him, so they kick him out, and he has to go and live in this run-down apartment. Surprisingly, this episode ends it here without a resolution. I think this is the beginning of a two-parter, or maybe some kind of story arc, so I'll have to wait and see how it all works out in the next episode. Even taking that aside though, it kind of works even as a standalone conclusion. We get to see how everyone else moves on to their next outrage target. However, Brian doesn't get to move on. This is still going to have a lingering effect on his life. And again, that is very true to how it works in real life. Now, I already mentioned my favourite jokes here, but the parody scene of Chris and Meg beating the crap out of everyone was so well done that it deserves an extra mention. Not only entertaining by itself, but well animated and a well executed parody to boot. Season 16, Episode 7, Peter 4. After bragging that he could beat any Russian in a fight, Peter ends up in conflict with Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, in order to pay his rent, Brian takes a job at a suicide hotline and falls for a co-worker. My best cutaway was the Polana All-Fruit commercial, and best moment was the Rocky IV style fight between Peter and Putin. I gave this one a 3 out of 5. In my opinion, there wasn't much meat on the bone for the actual main conflict here. The resumption to Brian's story was rather underwhelming. To keep paying his rent, he gets this job at a suicide hotline and meets a girl named Martha. However, he keeps screwing up any chance he might have with her. It was not pleasant to watch. And after the last episode where he was kind of the victim, so naturally became a bit more likeable, he went right back to being unlikable here. As for the main plot, it makes sense the guys were upset that the Russians edited Rocky IV to make Drago win, and Peter's letter directly to Putin was somewhat humorous. The bits of Peter and Putin interacting were just okay. The big revelation was that the Russians are apparently rigging everything which goes on in America. Peter, unhappy about this, challenges Vlad to a fight. This ending fight was probably my favourite bit. I liked how it referenced the Rocky movie, how the Russian crowd turned and started supporting the spirited American instead. Of course, given the time this episode aired, it mentioned Trump quite a bit. I liked the first gag about Trump texting Putin the cat emoji, gotta grab some of that. However, the ending one called Trump Putin's best friend, which was a bit on the nose, and frankly I don't think it's even true. Trump's policies towards Russia during his time in office didn't seem any more lenient than any other administration really, so it's just a show parroting the narrative that Trump is in Russia's pocket. Trump might be in someone's pocket, but I don't think it's the Russians. There were a number of decent jokes here which helped me enjoy the episode more, like the joke about the Russian women all being ones or tens. And of course the Polana All Fruit commercial. This is one of the rare occasions where the show over-explaining a joke actually made it funnier. Peter's commentary over this random 80s commercial is very funny. Would you please pass the jelly? Season 16, Episode 8. Crimes and Meg's demeanor. Meg gets drunk in order to fit in better at a party. Once Peter finds out, he wants to bond with Meg over her new love of alcohol. Meanwhile, Brian thinks Principal Shepherd killed his wife. My best cutaway was the flash of a high-powered toilet, stripping Peter of his clothes. And best moment was Principal Shepherd catching Brian and Stewie. I gave this one a 3 out of 5. So they wrapped up the story arc with Brian here. Overall, it was an interesting change for a few episodes, and it fits the experimental nature of this season. The story here was also somewhat interesting, if not at all original. Brian thinks that Principal Shepherd killed his wife because he sees him carrying a bin bag dripping with red. As it turned out though, it was just leaking cans of food. Despite its predictable and unoriginal nature, the atmosphere of this story worked well. Stewie getting trapped in his apartment and Shepherd waving at Brian through binoculars was all very good stuff. Meg had quite a good showing here. She seemed to have a bit more confidence and she managed to fit in a little, even if it took her getting drunk to do it. The scene with her and Peter on the boat was about as nice a moment as you will ever get between those characters. I should also mention this bizarre ending with Chris. He apparently has a telescope and is looking out there at the sky and the stars because his life sucks down here. It's a rare bit of introspection from Chris, but I don't expect it to be ever mentioned again. Season 16, Episode 9. Don't be a dickings at Christmas. Peter needs help getting into the Christmas spirit, so the ghost of Patrick Swayze appears to help him do it. Now, there were 3 cutaways here, but I didn't really like any of them, so I'll be damned if I give them credit. My best moment was the family's perplexed reaction to Peter's dance. I gave this one a 2 out of 5. This Christmas-themed episode wasn't that bad, but I was waiting for it to kick on to the next level, but it just stayed rather flat. Peter was getting this Scrooge-type lesson from the ghost of Patrick Swayze. Most of the scenes involving that weren't particularly entertaining or funny, but I did like the touch of how, after Peter died, Brian was still sleeping at his grave. The rest of the family didn't care about him at all though, as they all moved on in no time, especially Lois, who was almost begging for a new husband. Peter kind of learned a lesson about Christmas spirit, but not in a way which had any emotional impact. More in a way of, yeah, this is exactly how a run-of-the-mill Christmas episode would end. Almost like they were doing it because they thought it needed to happen. As I said though, Peter's bizarre dance with Patrick Swayze worked because the family couldn't see him. They could just see Peter dancing by himself, so thought he went completely insane. The Ollie Williams appearance was nice to see, as was Opie, being a lovely father to his kids, dressing up as Santa, and the ridiculous Kanye canes were decent I suppose. But again, I just struggled to get inspired by this episode. It felt slightly below average to me. Season 16, Episode 10, Boy Dog Meets Girl Dog. A lie which Peter and Lois told a young Chris about Valentine's Day comes back to haunt them. Also, Brian dates a female dog called Ellie. My best cutaway here was Peter's bad jokes, landing him in comedy jail and on death row. My best moment, or moments overall, were the Billy Joel songs. I gave this one a 4 out of 5. This episode was a bit crazy, but hey, they committed to it, so it came across as fun rather than annoying. Let's start with the Chris story. I like the scene of Peter and Lois trying to comfort preschool Chris. The chubby little fella is surprisingly adorable actually, and the whole Arthur Valentine story is so bizarre that it's something I can actually see Chris believing. Now it was Peter and Lois's bad decisions compounding themselves, which ended up with Chris going into this coma-like state. In the end though, they come clean to Chris that they made up Arthur Valentine to make him feel better, and he seemed okay with that. He certainly reacted to it much better than thinking Arthur Valentine was dead. So maybe, just maybe, honesty really is the best policy. Brian's side of things I quite enjoyed. It was great to see Brian dating another dog for a change. I swear we haven't seen that since he was briefly with Carter's dog Seabreeze way back in the early seasons. It immediately made him more likable for some reason. The female dog herself helped with that. The voice actress did a good job making her seem likable, despite being a pampered show dog. The ending scene where Brian can't perform under pressure, with everyone, including Quagmire, watching, was fine just about. Seeing from Ellie's perspective, while the boxer dog was doing his thing, was not necessary though. I thought the jokes here were good overall. The Billy Joe parody songs of We Didn't Start the Fire, about Peter eating random things, were all pretty entertaining, and I also enjoyed the confusing veterinarian's office. Season 16, Episode 11, Dog Bites Bear. After Brian bites Rupert into pieces, Stewie goes on a quest to scatter his ashes. Brian follows him to make sure he's okay. My best cutaway here was Peter becoming the superhero Red Stool, and my best moment was the ending. This one gets a 4 out of 5. It was a bit of a slow burner, with a few minutes at the start of Stewie and Brian just sat watching TV. They do establish how much Stewie is invested in Rupert, given how he's talking to him all the time, and it does get us to more easily understand how he becomes so distraught when Brian chews him up. Stewie is justifiably angry with Brian, and because of that, their scuffles in this episode do carry a bit more weight. The second half gets really good though. Brian follows Stewie all the way to Vermont to help him scatter Rupert on a mountain. He shows here that he really does care about Stewie, and even comes to regret the fact that he did indeed destroy Rupert on purpose. He manages to redeem himself in the end by helping an injured Stewie up the mountain, and giving a frank yet surprisingly meaningful tribute to Rupert. Now obviously Rupert is just a stuffed bear toy, but the significance of it is Brian understanding what he meant to Stewie. This is shown off even more when Brian goes out of his way to get a replacement Rupert at the end. At first I thought they would have killed Rupert off for good, but I'm kind of glad they went for this happy ending instead. I don't think it's a case of no lessons being learned, because I do feel Brian now understands Stewie a bit better. There was also a small subplot here of Peter with this dirty hand that had life growing on it. It was okay for what it was. In terms of the jokes here, There was Stewie's dog-related names for Brian, and Stewie's conversations with the other hikers coming down the mountain. And the Deadpool parody, Red Stool, was pretty funny. Season 16, Episode 12, Send in Stewie, please. A child psychologist examines Stewie, but Stewie is determined to make it as hard as possible for him. There was no cutaways here, but my best moment was the gag about all of Stewie's accents sounding like the same person. This one gets a 1 out of 5. Now, as my reviews of this season so far have proved, I do like the show trying new things, but this takes the piss just a little in my opinion. Look, they have done an episode with two characters just talking the whole time before, with Stewie and Brian in the vault. That was a divisive episode, which I was not a massive fan of. Well, this episode was a much worse version of that. At least that episode had an interesting dynamic between Brian and Stewie. This was just Stewie babbling the whole time, dressing down this random psychiatrist. The biggest issue was that it was so damn boring. Hardly any jokes were told. Sure, some of Stewie's lines were savage, but the person he was directing it to, I did not care at all about, one way or the other. So why would I care about his life being exposed? The only thing which caught my attention was him lying about being from Shropshire, just because that happens to be where I'm from, and I never expected it to get name-dropped in a show like Family Guy. The ending where Stewie refuses to get the guy's heart medication, killing him in the process, was clearly a nod to fans of the show, who say the character isn't evil enough anymore, as was the ending where he looks a bit guilty about it. But frankly, who cares? This was not some kind of deep dive into Stewie's character. Everything brought up here, like his fake voice etc., will just be forgotten about next episode. So this was just a waste of time. An incredibly boring waste of time. Season 16, Episode 13. V is for Mystery. Brian and Stewie set out to solve a mystery in Sherlock Holmes style. My best cutaway was the insult to Noel and Liam Gallagher from Oasis. Nothing against them personally, but yes, they're not exactly known for their looks. My best moment was the chase scene with the inconsistent lead. This one gets a 3 out of 5. There's not too much to discuss here. It's a fairly standard Sherlock Holmes type parody, but Stewie was a decent fit. As Holmes, actually. He has that snarky British way about him, and is obviously smart enough to play the role. That being said, I was not into the actual mystery here. It all felt very inconsequential, and the big reveal at the end was a bit too convoluted for its own good. I know that was kind of in Sherlock Holmes style too, but still, how this really got by was a number of snappy jokes and moments, like Neil Diamond on a ship, singing the wrong song, Bruce as a chimney sweeper, and the painter's pictures being repeatedly messed up. But my favourite of all was Brian and Stewie chasing Constance in a series of shots where she has an inconsistent lead on them. That is true to so many movies. Season 16, Episode 14, Veteran Guy. After the guys get caught pretending to be veterans, they are sentenced to join the Coast Guard. My best cutaway was Peter and the useless automatic bathroom sink. And my best moment was Quagmire saving the guys from both the frat boys with guns and the bomb. This one gets a 3 out of 5. Another okay average episode here. The guys pretending to be veterans at the start wasn't used for as many shenanigans as it could have been actually. The most they got out of it was a few jabs at Southwest Airlines. I did at least appreciate them remembering that Quagmire was in the Navy, so not technically pretending to be a vet. Still, despite not getting sentenced to it by the court, he still stepped up and volunteered his service anyway. Sure, it was only to the Coast Guard, but it's better than nothing. Quagmire took the job very seriously as well, and quite understandably got annoyed at his friends mucking around. So much so that he quit the job. Sure, the ending where he comes back to save the day was a bit predictable, but I still enjoyed it regardless. I think I just enjoy Quagmire actually getting motivated about something. He gets really serious and really competent when he puts his mind to things. This was not the funniest episode overall, but Peter struggling to get the automated sink to work is definitely another which falls into the relatable category. Season 16, Episode 15, The Wolf of Wall Street. Brian and Stewie have success trading on the stock market. However, Brian soon gets himself in trouble. My best cutaway was how Brian always imagined dying slowly as an inconvenience to the family. My best moment was Stewie and Brian trying to pants James Cameron. This one gets a 3 out of 5. First things first, boy did they like playing the song Life is a Highway in this episode. It wasn't too bad in fairness, but it had to be commented on. In terms of the actual story, it was nice to see Stewie have success at the stock market. Let's face it, it's totally believable that he would. However, as expected, when Brian got involved, it all went to hell. He got a bit too big for his boots and carried away with his success, and started acting like he was the main man, trying to take over from Stewie. At least the episode acknowledges that he is being a dick here. Stewie even says how hard it is to be on the guy's side. All of the problems Brian faces are his own fault. He did not take the ethical approach and stop supporting this company, killing dogs for protein shakes, and almost got himself made into a shake because of it. Stewie of course comes to his rescue in the end, and refuses to let Brian say it was the stock market that was evil, rather it was how Brian used it which was. Even if Brian will learn nothing from this, I'm at least glad that Stewie never let him move the responsibility away from himself. The side plot of the guys taking care of the bar for Jerome was half finished at best, so nothing much to discuss. I did like Quagmire getting annoyed at everyone for cheating at trivia though. My favourite moments in the episode were Stewie and Brian accidentally ripping James Cameron apart with the big submarine while trying to just pull his pants down. That was just surprising, and Brian as an elderly sick dog was kind of funny. Sure, some people may find it sad because it is quite accurate to how old dogs get, but that makes the moment even better for me. At least a dog which gets to that age has lived a full life, probably with a loving family, and Peter was that loving family member in this instance, which was nice to see. Season 16, Episode 16, Family Guy Through the Years. Family Guy celebrates 60 years on the air, going through various time periods on the show. My best cutaway was Peter knows war, having stormed the beaches at Normandy. And my best moment was the 1950s Raisin Bran commercial. This one gets, you might have guessed, another 3 out of 5. So yes, another different style of episode here, with them acting like Family Guy has been on the air for 60 years, going through what the show would have looked like at various decade intervals. The first part in the 50s was my favourite, just because we got some of that real old school vibe, like Elvis being on the Ed Sullivan Show, and all the references to the bland TV shows and commercials. That Raisin Bran advert was even drier than the actual grape itself, after being left in the sun for a long period of time. Now, the trippy 60s bit was a bit cliché and not that memorable, but I did like the gag of all of Peter's fathers inexplicably being alive and lecturing him. Screw the continuity, I am totally on board with him having Asian family heritage. The 70s part was a Vietnam War take. It was clever and subversive that it was the repetitive music that drove Quagmire insane, not the actual horrors of war. And the gag of Peter storming the beaches in 1958 with much less resistance was quite good. Chalk this one up as another solid change of pace. Season 16, Episode 17, Switch the Flip. Stewie, Brian, Peter and Chris accidentally get caught in Stewie's new machine, and swap bodies. When trying to get things back to normal, they inadvertently swapped the bodies of everyone in town. My best cutaway here was Stewie at Disneyland refusing to duck for the family photo. Now sure, he didn't have to duck if he didn't want to, but standing up only to get decapitated was perhaps not the best idea he's ever had. And my best moment was the news crew's reaction to being in different bodies. I gave this one a 4 out of 5. Not that this was an original concept at all, because it wasn't, but this trope of having characters changing bodies I think fits Family Guy more than most other shows. For example, how Chris in Brian's body argues with Brian in Chris's body about all the urges their new bodies have. As they say, it allows them to learn some new, rather embarrassing things about each other. It also allows for some jokes to flow, as we pop in on various townspeople as they discover their new look. My favourite was Trisha in Ollie's body, and vice versa. It was freaky! Now, the drama in the story was kind of non-existent. It was obvious that everyone would get sorted before Stewie in Peter's body had to sleep with a sex-crazed Lois. Although, Brian apparently got shifted into Peter's body to do the deed, so I'm sure he's happy about that. As well as the more in-your-face jokes relating to the body switching, I found some more subtle ones here which I enjoyed. Like Quagmire saying, they've all switched bodies, let's go. I like that he could discern that in no time. Or Brian resting his head on a sofa in a sympathetic pose. Overall, this was a simple, unoriginal, yet very enjoyable watch. Season 16, Episode 18, HTT Pete. Peter adopts the millennial lifestyle to help promote the brewery. My favourite cutaway here was Peter having trouble folding the map on their trip to Europe, and my best moment was Peter's 6-second talk show. I gave this one a 3 out of 5. Obviously the main goal of this was to relentlessly mock millennials and all the useless things they are stereotypically into. It did partially work. I'm sure some millennials got offended at their portrayal, and I'm sure plenty of these stereotypes do apply too. Despite that, they were still rather lazy stereotypes, by having them all act like pretentious douches who waste their time focusing on pointless things, like online meme culture for example, or whether they have the trendiest clothes or newest fashion. They are portrayed as hipsters basically, which again, probably has some truth to it, but at the same time is very broad and perhaps a bit outdated. Now, I don't consider myself a millennial at all, even though I was technically born right on the cutoff between them and Gen Z, November 96 for anyone curious. But I have still seen enough of millennials, and Gen Zers to be fair, to know what this episode said had some weight. Especially the bits towards the end, about an over-reliance on the internet. Now I am guilty of this myself, no doubt. Overall I think the internet is a great thing, but it probably would benefit everyone to take some time away from it, now and again. All the characters here just served the narrative, so Peter's time as a millennial didn't have much to analyse about it. But I did like how he destroyed the internet by peeing on the computer because he thought it was some kind of technological urinal. And his 6-second talk show was rather clever, as a cash-in idea. There is also the slightly dark joke about how he was roommates with Oscar Pistorius. Overall, despite all the flashy messaging, this was average quality-wise. Season 16, Episode 19. The Unkindest Cut. Quagmire suffers a freak shark attack and loses his penis. Meanwhile, Stewie and Brian try and track down Mort, who is on the run from the government. My best cutaway here was the golf announcer who knows nothing about the sport. And my best moment overall was Peter trying to reverse his car down the boat ramp. I gave this one a 3 out of 5. Now obviously Quagmire losing his penis in a very graphic way is not necessarily pleasant viewing, And that wasn't the only part of the main story which I felt a bit uneasy about. After we had a few scenes showing Quagmire understandably distraught over his situation and attempting suicide, his dad decided to come to the rescue by offering his removed penis, which he apparently kept in the fridge. So Quagmire gets that attached to him and, I guess, tries to go on as normal. That whole thing was not only weird, it also doesn't make any sense. Now, I'm no expert on sex change operations, nor would I want to be, but I'm pretty sure they don't actually remove the penis. From my understanding, it's just kind of inverted into the body, so it wouldn't be available in like one solid piece for anyone else to use as their own. So yeah, the whole thing made no sense, and was frankly a bit gross. The side plot was decent, with Mort being on the run, and Stewie and Brian trying to beat the mob to track him down to get the bounty, although the ending, where Mort had already turned himself in, didn't seem to make much sense. There were a few good jokes here to make up for not the best plot. The golf announcer winging it I found quite funny, but the whole boat scene was a classic in my opinion. Sure, it was dragged out for like a minute, but this was one of the times where the dragged out gag made it funnier. The way it slowly escalated with Peter's comments and more people gathering to watch it. It's also very realistic if you've ever seen people try and get their boats in the water at those types of ramps. Season 16, Episode 20. Are you there, God? It's me, Peter. Peter meets God after falling into a coma and must prove to him that he loves his family. My best cutaway here was the Russian version of the Tequila song, where Peter just stands there and goes, vodka. Sure, it's dragged out, but I found it funny. And my best moment was Peter's attempt at an emotional goodbye to his family. The season finale gets a 2 out of 5. Now, some of the bits at the start with Peter lounging around on the couch and getting stuck to it was somewhat enjoyable. It's the type of behaviour you expect from a character like him. The scene at the doctor's was interesting, for example, and how he tries to live his life like nothing's happened, like the couch has been there all along. However, he rather abruptly gets put into a coma, and meets God in this kind of purgatory state, I guess. For the most part, this kind of fell flat for me. His interactions with God weren't particularly funny, and there was a lot of making fun of religion as you would expect. The only parts which threatened to be interesting was when they started talking about whether this was some kind of simulation or whether reincarnation exists. Basically Peter trying to get to the truth of reality. They never delved deep into that though, which was kind of a shame because I've always been fascinated by that kind of thing. About all the unknowns there are relating to us, the universe and reality. But no, instead we got this fairly vanilla Peter has to go back to prove himself plot. It wasn't at all convincing. He totally fails to be nice to his family and accepts his fate, only for God to let him go back anyway because he was proven right. Okay, not sure that makes sense, but it is what it is. The only saving grace was that I did find Peter's abject failure at an emotional moment quite funny, especially when Stewie says, "Is anyone gonna stop him?" After Peter tells him that he's going to grow up to be a man, loving twink. Sadly though, the jokes were underwhelming like the story, other than those two I mentioned, so this was definitely a disappointing way to end the season. So welcome to the summary of Season 16. The overall season average score was 3, bang on the nose, which is again a improvement. I'll talk about it in more detail later on. But first, my bottom 5 episodes were V is for Mystery at 5, which was a 3 rated episode, so it's kind of a compliment to this season that this episode is on the list, as there were only 4 2 rated or lower episodes. Those were 3 Directors at 4, Don't Be a Dickens at Christmas at 3, Are You There, God? It's Me, Peter at 2, and Send in Stewie Please was the only 1 rated episode and by far the worst. My top 5 were Boy Dog Meets Girl Dog at 5, Follow the Money at 4, DD in Apartment 23 At 3, Switch the Flip at 2, and number 1 was Dog Bites Bear. So to try and sum up this season overall, I would call it okay or average just about. I definitely think it does enough to avoid the bad tag. Not because there were many amazing episodes, but because, as the chart shows, there weren't many bad ones, and over half the season was 3 out of 5 rated episodes, which again never left me feeling amazed by the quality, but did make it so the season was always watchable. Outside of one episode, I never really felt bored during it. Now I don't want to give you the wrong impression because, in terms of the ratings, this season sounds a bit bland, but in reality it was anything but. This was one of the most interesting seasons I've ever covered. The writers and people behind the show clearly set out to create a different feel to this season. Over half the episodes here were changes of the usual format. There were a few trilogy episodes, an episode where the premise was the show's lack of an Emmy in real life, a full episode parody of Sherlock Holmes, and they even pretended the show had been around for 60 years. Not to mention a 3-part story arc where Brian moves out of the house. In fact, there were so many format bender episodes here, they literally butted in the middle of a few of them, with Peter saying something to the effect of, "Don't worry, we'll be back to a normal episode next week." I always welcome a show trying to be creative, and this was no exception. Even if there were no outright classics, the weird and different situations carried the day enough to make it a worthwhile watch. I don't expect this to continue next season. If it does, that would be wild, but as long as they maintain this rough level, I'm fine with it. Another thing to note about this season is the relative lack of cutaways. Now sure, the structure of the episodes dictated that, to some extent, but even in normal episodes, there were less than normal. Now that is something I am interested in seeing, whether it continues or not. Anyway, that's my talk done. Please let me know your thoughts about this rather unique season. Also, please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed. That's all folks. I'll see you later. Take care.